Hi, it's Denny Somack, and I'm a rock historian, producer, and best selling author. And this is the number one podcast for classic rock, The Rock Podcast. Now, this episode's going to be a bit different than what you usually see and hear. It's a special edition. As you know, we usually interview different guests. We have that, except that I am the guest, discussing my new Led Zeppelin book, Get the Let Out: How Led Zeppelin Became the Biggest Band in the World. Since I'm the guest on this edition of the Rock Podcast, I've asked a good friend of mine to be the host. He's a well-known broadcaster, has been a DJ and program director at several major radio stations. He was voted Rock Program Director of the Year by his peers 3 times. Neal also worked at MTV in the programming department and also produced the nationally syndicated Howard Stern show. And if that weren't enough things for a resume, Neal Mirsky was a kid actor and appeared in Car 54, Where Are You? I'm exhausted just telling you about him. So let me introduce Neal, and we can get started discussing my new book, Get the Let Out, now out and available at most stores, including Barnes & Nobles, Walmart, or you can go to Amazon and order it there. Okay, Neal.
Hello, and welcome to the Rock Podcast with Denny Somack. My name is Neal Mirsky, and I'm going to be substituting for Denny Somack as the host for this show because it would be kind of hard for Denny to interview his guest, who happens to be Denny Somack. Hello, Denny, and welcome.
Hey, Neal, how you doing? Thanks for doing this. I appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. I enjoy watching and listening to your podcasts for a long time now, and
Thank you.
it's kind of cool to be substitute hosting.
By the way, I that shirt looks familiar. What is that?
This shirt was a gift from Robert Plant. I was programming a radio station in New Haven. He was in town for a concert. He wanted to shoot a 4th video from that album. Atlantic Records only wanted to stop at 3. He called me up and asked if I could get like a couple of hundred people down to the arena 2 hours before the show so he could just do a cheapo video for the song.
Right.
And I did. And the next day, this shirt showed up with a nice thank you note from Robert.
Wow.
Pretty cool.
What year was that? Do you remember?
Uh, 84,
Okay.
5, right? Somewhere in the mid 80s. It's all a blur. Who
Yes.
knows? So
Yes.
let's talk about this book, Get the Let Out: How Led Zeppelin Became the Biggest Band in the World.
Here it is.
And there it
Out
is.
now and in stores and on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. It's all over the place.
Now, this is a new edition of
Right.
an original book that you had published, which, I've had it for a long time, thanks to you.
Yeah, I think it was
And
back in 2012 when it originally came out.
I've got a lot of rock and roll books in my library, and yours is like my favorite coffee table book. There's so much. You don't have to read it. You can just thumb through it because there's so many images and stories and just it's really easy to read. And if you're a Led Zeppelin fan, and who isn't?
Yeah.
Um, it's I learned so much. There was so much that I didn't know about Led Zeppelin, and I thought I knew a lot.
I thought I did too. And then I started uncovering things that I had never seen before. And I know there are probably 100 and some books on Led Zeppelin done over the years, but most of them, the majority of them, were written by people who weren't born when they came out, never met any of them, never saw them live. A lot of them, were born after they broke up. So I check all the boxes. I've seen them live. Yardbirds are my favorite band. Um, and I like to think I know pretty much, but I was able to dig deep and get some stuff.
Well, you referenced a moment ago about the things you learned that you didn't know about them.
Yeah.
And a perfect example for me, and it relates to the book, because I tell us about who wrote the foreword to the book, and then tell us why him.
Okay. Well, Carmine Appice wrote the forward, and originally I talked to Paul Rogers. I thought there'd be a connection, Swanson, but then I realized Carmine is John Bonham's mentor, and in fact, if you remember, right after Bonham died, there were mentions of the only people that could possibly fill that space was either Carmine or I forget his name now, the drummer who was in the Move, the really big guy. And of course they didn't want to replace him, so they never did. But Carmine was on tour with the Vanilla Fudge in late during 1968, and the opening act was Led Zeppelin. So the record had been sent to him before it even came out. He was the first person in America to hear it, first person to see them live, and struck up a friendship with Bonham the first time he met him. And Bonham was like, "Oh, you're my idol. Can you get me a set of drums like you have with the cymbals?" And Carmine said, "Sure." And he called his drum company, and they got Bonham everything he had. So he was the perfect person to get because he he said they're the only band. He actually said this to me. I've never had anyone admit this to me. He said they were the only band that ever blew us off the stage. Because what happened was the tour started. It was Vanilla Fudge, a band called Spirit in the middle. Some dates had Iron Butterfly, and then it was Led Zeppelin. Now, 3 months later, it was Led Zeppelin, just Vanilla Fudge and Led Zeppelin. The second tour, the bill flipped. It was Vanilla Fudge opening for, or co-headlining actually, for Led Zeppelin. And then the next tour, when they played with them, they were the middle act. So, that's never happened that I know of.
I mean, I knew that, Led Zeppelin had opened for Vanilla Fudge their first time touring in America, but I had no idea that Carmine was such an influence on Bonham. And when I saw Carmine, and just to quickly wrap this part up, when you had told me that story, and I happened to mention to you, hey, I'm going to see Carmine next week we're going to both be at the same
Right.
mutual friend's Christmas party. And that's when you asked me if I would ask him if he would write
Yeah.
the forward for the book. And Carmine told me, he says, I never let anybody know, that Bonham thought of me as his mentor until after late in his life, when Bonham had actually said it in an interview
Right.
and had acknowledged it, because that's just Carmine, didn't want to like take any kind of glory from it. But I had no idea that that influence was there.
Yeah, and they were both on Atlantic Records, so that was a positive too. But yeah, he saw the first several dates, and it was amazing. I think they were looking at the set list in the early first couple of dates on the tour. They were still doing completely different version of it, but they were doing For Your Love. Everything else was all from the first album. So. But yeah,
Uh,
no, he was ecstatic, and he saw him again throughout the years. But they played together again on the Atlantic 40th anniversary concert, if you remember that. And of course, he had, and then when he died, it was a big deal for him.
it's funny you mentioned about there must be at least 100 books about Led Zeppelin that are out there.
Right,
And at that show in New Haven, when Robert gave him this shirt, uh, there was a guy there who handed him a copy of that book, Hammer of the Gods,
right,
and asked Robert to sign it. And Robert says, I'm not signing that piece of shit. There
right,
won't be the real story until I write the book.
right, exactly. And now with
But
the documentary out, we have at least a clue as to the beginning of the band. In fact, I'll tell you something. I don't know if you know, you saw the documentary,
Oh, I
obviously.
loved it.
Um, I never heard, I know he'd made other movies, but I never really heard of that filmmaker. And I later found out that obviously everybody has approached them over the years to do the definitive documentary. And the reason that this guy got the job, because he said, I'm going to concentrate on the first two albums. I don't want to do the debauchery and all the other stuff. And they said, that's exactly what we want. We can't go into all that kind of stuff. Just focus on the first two albums. And that's what he did. So that's how he got the gig.
You know, their manager, Peter Grant,
Yeah.
has quite the reputation, had
Yes.
quite the reputation. He's gone now.
Right.
Have you had any experiences with him yourself?
No, I haven't. I do have, there's a biography on him written by Chris Charlesworth, which is really good. And that's the only connection to him but I've heard people talk about him. I mean, I could tell you a real quick story, not related to my book, but there was a period of time when Yes had broken up after the Drama album, and there was, Zeppelin had already broken up, and Chris lived next to Jimmy in England, and Jimmy said, "You let's get together and jam sometime," because he hadn't picked up a guitar in a year. And they did, and they started recording some stuff, and they actually decided they wanted to do a band, and they were going to call it XYZ. It was Alan White and Chris Squire and Jimmy Page. And Robert Plant was asked, but he thought it was a little too complicated, so he didn't want to get involved. Anyway, they decided to proceed. They had three songs recorded. I actually have a couple of them. And Chris told me, and he knew Grant obviously over the years, because Yes and Zeppelin were the two biggest bands on Atlantic. He said, I remember when we decided to, do this, I had to go over to Peter Grant's house to tell him what's going on because he still managed Jimmy. So he said, I went to Peter's house and we sat down and he said he exaggerated a little bit, I think. He said, well, we argued for an hour over what the name of the band should be. And, because Peter said, well, I don't like the fact that, Y comes before Z. And Chris said, well, that's the alphabet, Peter. And they got into this heated discussion, and Peter Grant put his cigarette out in Chris's hand. He just like he was and anyway, it never happened. But now I understand they may actually release those sessions. I heard
Wow, I'd love to
Jimmy in
hear
an
that.
interview say that. But yeah, it's one of the songs actually eventually landed on a Yes album, and one of the other songs landed on the second Firm album in a different version, obviously. But that would have been some group, I'll tell you.
I remember Peter Grant's scene in the concert film where he's
Song
beating
remains the
up on
same.
on,
Yeah.
on the t-shirt bootleggers and stuff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. He was.
You didn't mess with him.
No, he laid down the law. He wouldn't allow filming, recording. He wouldn't allow singles to be released. He wouldn't do television. He laid down the law. In fact, one of the interviews in the book, I interview the guy who was their publicist, and his name is Bill Harry, who had worked with the Beatles.
Right.
Bill Harry says, I said, Bill, I want, you were publicist for the band. Tell me what happened. He goes, well, I had been publicist for the Beatles, so a lot of people were approaching me, and I had a lot of clients. And I got a call from Peter Grant because I had done some work with the Yardbirds. And I went to his office, and he said, listen, I want you to be the publicist for Led Zeppelin. And he said, great. And Peter Grant said to him, and here's your job, keep the press away. He said, I couldn't believe it. He hired me to keep the press away. He didn't want to do any interviews or anything. So that was my job. I traveled with him basically to tell the press no interviews.
How many people do you figure you interviewed in researching this book?
Oh, gosh, I would say close to 100. Yeah, easily yeah, and then probably even more over the years because I didn't want to write, everybody's writing the story, doing research and write. I didn't want to do it that. I wanted the book to be told by the people who actually knew them. And I don't mean one or two people. I mean people that actually knew them, communicated with them, had a relationship. Like I got their road manager, Richard Cole, who's a notorious character. He's in The Song Remains the Same movie also. The publicist, Danny Goldberg, who is a writer and a former record guy, and he was vice president of Swan Song Records. And Danny's story is great because he was a publicist for them. And Peter Grant said, "Listen, we'd like you to run our label, Swan Song, in America." And Danny said to him, "Well, okay, but I got to have the title of vice president because that means more in America." And Peter Grant said, "Okay, you're vice president." So, and he had great stories, obviously, because he was a press guy. So he used to do things like, and he tells it in the book. He said, when they played in, I think it was Tampa Stadium, he said, they outdrew the Beatles, and I made it a big deal. And he
I,
said,
I I was at that show,
"Oh, you
Denny,
were okay."
and they right before Led Zeppelin came on stage, they released like 100 white doves from the stage and
Yeah.
announced that they had just broken the Beatles' Shea Stadium record for the largest crowd. I believe it was 70,000 people.
Yeah. Well, being a publicist and publicist mind, said, well, the only reason that happened was, we had more, the stadium was bigger than Shea Stadium. That's
Right,
that's why. So I
right.
trumped on that, and the newspapers all picked it up. So, he was really good for them. But, they were those first couple of albums, obviously, I remember hearing the first album. I was in Fort Lauderdale visiting my grandparents, and I heard it on WSRF. I think. Yeah. I heard Dazed and Confused. And then I heard Good Times, Bad Times. And I was like flabbergasted. That's the first recollection. That was January, I guess, of 69.
Wow. Yeah,
So anyway,
I
over
had
the
just
years, I've just been collecting all these stories. I'd run into people, like Joe Perry of Aerosmith, very tight with the band. In fact, they got Jimmy to play with them at a couple of festivals, and also when they did the Marquee Club, they got Jimmy to come in, and he said it was like being in heaven because they did all Yardbird songs, and he was like dying. So I got major musicians. Alice Cooper, by the way, co-headlined with Zeppelin at the Whiskey A Go Go, and he said, we didn't know who this other band was. We thought they were from the Valley. Who? Yeah, I don't know who they are. And then we got there and we recognized Jimmy Page, and Alice is such a huge fan. He goes, and we knew that Jimmy was a Yardbird. So, but we didn't know who was. We just flipped a coin, and they opened one night, and we closed, and the other night we alternated. So, but he had some great stories about that. So those are the kind of people I wanted to get. And Paul Rogers, obviously, because they were on Swan Song, and Peter Grant was their manager, and he was in the firm with Jimmy. So I tried to get key people. Obviously, I got the a couple of the producers, Eddie Kramer. Although Jimmy's credited with being producer on all the albums, Kramer was the engineer, sort of producer, but he's the guy that did Hendrix and all that kind of stuff. And Ron, I'm forgetting his name now, um, who did half of the Physical Graffiti album. So I got two of the main producers to talk, and their insight is just amazing. Um, I, I'm trying to think. I have a couple of interesting things that are in the book that sort of unreleased. And then later on, I'm going to give you some breaking news.
ooh.
First of all, there's a female band called Les Zeppelin, and I went to see them a few years ago. So I contacted the founder of the band, and she's the lead singer, Steph Paines, and I interviewed her for the book. And she doesn't consider them a tribute band or a sound-alike band. She says, "We're just a band. We happen to do Led Zeppelin songs." And she got invited. Jimmy had heard about them. And when they came over to England to do some dates, he went to see them. And he invited her to the O2 Arena show. So he's aware. And at some point, it's possible he may play with them. They're still out there playing. They have a couple of CDs out, and they were smart enough to get Eddie Kramer to engineer their CD. So, but
You know,
it's people
is
like
there
that.
one of my favorite Led Zeppelin stories, and I'm curious if you cover it in the book, is the infamous Stairway to Gilligan's Island story.
I don't, it may be one of the Robert Plant interviews. I don't know if I left it in or not, but I'll tell you what the story. I try to get people, Ann and Nancy Wilson, who are heavily influenced by them. In fact, I remember the interview with Nancy. I said to her, I don't know if anybody's ever mentioned this to you, but you actually wrote a Led Zeppelin song. And she's like, "What are you talking about?" I said, "Barracuda." Led Zeppelin would have a field day with that song. And she just looked at me like, "Whoa, I never thought of it like that." So I try to get stuff from people that normally other people wouldn't. I don't know how many people would have said that to her, but I had to say it to her because Barracuda to me is like Led Zeppelin, you know. Anyway, uh, um, I tried to get people that hadn't been interviewed, and actually, a couple of these people are no longer alive. I wanted to get the real story of how they got signed to Atlantic. Now, Jerry Wexler, who signed them, he was a vice president at Atlantic, has been gone for 20 some years, but he's the guy who signed it. But I knew Joe Smith at Warner Brothers, and he had done an interview with Jerry for a book he did years ago. And Jerry told him the story. He said, what happened was I was neighbor. My neighbor was their attorney. Okay, was my neighbor, Steve. I forget his last name. And I was out at the mailbox one day getting my mail, and Steve comes out and he's getting his mail, and he turns to me and he goes, "Listen, I'm representing Jimmy Page's new band." And Wexler said, "Well, I know Jimmy Page. He was in the Yardbirds, and we've used him for sessions. He's a great session musician." And the lawyer said to him, Steve Weiss, that was his name. The lawyer said to him, "Listen, would you have any interest in signing them? Because I'm out getting him a deal and I'm down to two labels. And one, they're not going to give me what I want. And the other one, I think the guy's an idiot. I'm not going to tell you what label it is, but I don't want to deal with him. So if you would like Led Zeppelin on Atlantic, you got him." Well, of course, he said, "Absolutely." So, a couple weeks later, Jimmy and Peter Grant fly over with the album was finished because Jimmy paid for it himself. It was like 2,000 bucks, all done. They go in and they play it for him, and Atlantic is, ecstatic. And of course, they know who Jimmy was and the Yardbirds and everything. And they got signed. And at the time, they got an advance of almost $200,000, which was the highest advance ever paid for a band. Let me backtrack though for 1 minute, because here's a story a lot of people don't know. I didn't know. Columbia, Epic, claimed they had the rights to Led Zeppelin because the Yardbirds had been on Epic. What they
And
didn't
then became the New
realize, yeah,
Yardbirds.
it's a thing called a leaving member clause that most groups have to sign when they sign, which if somebody leaves the group, the head label has a chance to sign them. The case with the Yardbirds were signed to Epic, but Jimmy came later and he never signed as a member of the Yardbirds. So he had to tell Columbia, "You don't have any claim on this." And that's how this, I mean, it's such an amazing story. So when Jerry Wexler said, "Okay, we're going to pay 135,000. I'll get the rest of the money from my overseas people because we want the world." And he went to the head of overseas Atlantic, and this is when Atlantic was a much smaller label. They weren't owned by Warner, we. And he said the guy said, "No, I'm not putting up $65,000 or whatever it was that you need." So Wexler had to get the money from somewhere else, but he eventually got it. And I think the exact number might have been like 189 something, but with the options and everything, it was well over 200. And it was, for two albums a year and all that kind of stuff. There's a copy of the contract, which I want, it's in the public domain because of the lawsuit over Stairway to Heaven, which I'll get to in a little bit. But I went and I studied that contract, and it's 9 pages. So it wasn't like today where they're 200 pages. Very simple. They get X amount every time they deliver an album. Here's the royalties. And, Jimmy put in things like, record company's not allowed to come to the studio. We don't want any interference. We pick the covers. All that stuff that you hear about was because Jimmy asked for it and they gave it to him. And obviously, as you know, they became the biggest selling band on Atlantic. The two biggest selling bands back at that time in the early 70s was Yes and Zeppelin. And, Zeppelin sold a lot of records for him. And believe it or not, the third biggest selling band, not by album, but I didn't know this because I was doing research, the biggest selling singles band, now this may have changed in the last few years, was Foreigner, which I didn't realize. They sold a lot of albums, but they
Yeah.
sold so many millions of singles. It was amazing. Now, I know a lot of this because I interviewed someone who never really gives interviews, and that was the chairman of Atlantic Records, who happens to be a big Zeppelin fan, obviously, Craig Kalman. And, he talks about it. And of course, he has to be careful because he's got all these other bands on the label. But, he talked about it and everything. But something he did, he said, the thing about Zeppelin wouldn't allow any singles except for they let Whole Lot of Love and I think Immigrant Song in America. But nobody was allowed to put out singles anywhere. And all of a sudden, there were like 30 different countries around the world that started to put out Zeppelin singles with picture sleeves. And of course, they had to send them to New York for approval, and they all got either pulled or destroyed. Well, Craig, being a huge Zeppelin fan, has a copy of every one of the picture sleeves. So they were on his wall, and he said, "Would you like to shoot them and put them in the book?" And I said, "Are you kidding? No one's seen any of these from all these different countries." So I thought that was kind of cool. And if you're a collector, there's no other place to see something like that. So I
Yeah.
all I also interviewed the head of auctions at Heritage Auction, and he told me, he said, very seldom does anything by Led Zeppelin come up for auction. He said, but we happen to have, this was in last year's auction, a John Bonham drumhead, which I think eventually sold for like $51,000. But very few autographs, very few anything by Zeppelin ever shows up because it just doesn't.
Yeah, wow. How about speaking of collectibles, how about the object? I'm sure you have photos
Yes.
in the book, but tell us a little bit about how many were made, what their value
Okay,
is.
yeah, there now the thing is the object is the thing that's on the cover of the Presence album, that black obelisk, I guess would call it an obelisk?
Oblong, yeah, something.
Obelisk. I mean, the term. And it just for some reason the artist put it in there and it became, a thing. Now Atlantic had 1,000 of them made up and they were all numbered and sent out to radio stations to influential programmers. And I'm sure you got one. I
No, I was a
didn't get
poor
one.
disc jockey then.
Oh,
I didn't
okay.
get one.
But over the years, they've been very coveted. And actually, mine, I won't say, I had two of them actually, because the guy I was working with passed away later on, and I just took it from his house. Mine ended up at the Hard Rock Cafe because I had a friend that worked, well, we had a friend that worked there, and he said, I've never had the chance to get one of these. And so that's where my other one is. I'm keeping mine. I don't even remember what number I have, like 110 or something like that. But yeah, that's something that's one of the most coveted. Now, in the book, I have a whole section on memorabilia. And what I did was the world's largest Zeppelin collector happens to be a guy who lives in Virginia, and he's been collecting for years. And in fact, when you remember years ago, they did that traveling Zeppelin exhibition. They used his collection to be shown, and his stuff. Oh, by the way, here's the object with the box that it came in. Obviously, if you have the box and it's unopened, it's worth a fortune. If you have the box and it's open, that adds to it. But otherwise, that's what it looks like. Now, it has been bootlegged. I don't know if you know that. There
No,
are
I didn't.
bootlegs of this, so you got to be careful. Some people over the years have. It's easy to copy, I guess, but you can tell. by the characteristics. Anyway, um, Brian Knapp is the guy's name. He lives in Virginia, and his house. I went to his house, and I said, I gotta film everything in your house. And we agreed on, he let me do it. And that's where all the memorabilia comes from. Posters, tickets, stubs, backstage passes, uh, everything. He didn't collect records though. He was into the memorabilia. He's got all seven of the ticket stubs from the 7 nights they did in Japan. Full tickets from the Madison Square Garden show, just anything you can imagine. And he's sitting on this stuff. I've asked him, I said, what are you going to do? He said, well, at some point I may sell it. He said, I've been offered a lot of money, but I just want to keep it. And literally in his house, under the beds, in every closet, um, Zeppelin memorabilia. It was just amazing. So I tried to get things like that in here that other people might not be able to get. I got access to him because a couple of people from Atlantic told me about him. And when I called him, he said, okay, yeah, if you sort of an official book, I'll let you do this, but I don't normally let people. Of course, he charged me, which I didn't have a problem with that. So I spent 2 days at his house in Virginia just filming everything I could. I hired a photographer, and that's the stuff that you see in the book. I tried to be like a fan, as much as I could. Now, obviously, there's all sorts of people in here. If you remember the Joshua Light Show,
Yeah.
the light show. Now, back in those days, the Fillmore, they also did the lights, which I had completely forgotten about. Led Zeppelin played the Newport Jazz Festival, and Josh did the lights for that too. It was just at one point the Newport Jazz Festival decided we got to have a couple of rock bands on because we don't want to be, get outdated. So during that period, Zeppelin was the band that they got for one of the I don't remember the exact year it was, but Josh is in here, and it's still one of the most famous light shows. He's the guy that did all the shows at the Fillmore, and he talks about what it was like, but he didn't get to see the band
Right.
because light shows you work from behind. So he never saw them play, but he did all the stuff for them. Um, and back in those days, the bands didn't have the say on the lights and all that stuff. And nowadays, if you told Led Zeppelin you're going to have somebody do their light show, they'd shoot you. But back
Right.
then, Josh did everybody. He later became a filmmaker, did some documentaries. He's still around. I talked to him not too long ago. But his stories were really amazing because he said he never saw. He did the first 2 tours at the Fillmore, and then he said they never came back because it just became too big. He said I've never seen that happen with a band that fast. That was the one thing that most people remember. They said, "Yeah, I saw Zeppelin, and the next thing you know, they're playing in a stadium." So those are the kinds of stories that I got in here, and they're all a little crazy. And then I have interviews with all the members of the bands from over the years, which I transcribed for my collection. And that's really what the gist of the book is. I think there's about 30 some interviews. And then I had some original, yeah, all backstage passes I got from that guy. He's got them all in here. And then anything I had an artist um, do some original Zeppelin artwork, which is in the book also. So it's I tried to get as much as I could in there. Now, the other interview I wanted to mention, because this is pretty exclusive, is if you remember, there was a lawsuit over Stairway to Heaven. Um, a guy named Randy California in the band Spirit wrote a song called Taurus, which is on the first Spirit album. Zeppelin were big fans of Spirit. And in fact, Spirit was the middle act between Zeppelin and Vanilla Fudge when they first came over. But they also played with them a couple times in England. And I think it's on the BBC Live album. They actually do covers of two Spirit songs. So they were big Spirit. Fresh Garbage, and I don't remember the other one. Just excerpts from it. So they were big. So when that case came, where they got sued by the estate of Randy California, And everybody's talked about it over the years, and people say, well, why didn't anybody do anything before that? And the thing was, it's so expensive to start a suit like that without having, and these groups didn't want to, I mean, you had to go against Zeppelin's lawyers. The only reason the guy got the case representing the estate is because he said it's the most unbelievable case, and they're my favorite band. I want to be the lawyer, so I'll do it for free. That's how he got the case. Now, there's only one living member of Spirit, and that's Mark Andes, bass player. And he was later in Firefall and later in Heart. And
He
what
was
happened?
also in JoJo Gunn.
Yeah, Jojo Gunn, you're right. What happened was I, the lawyer contacted me and asked me to if I'd be an expert witness in the case because he said he had heard me. I'd been on the Howard Stern show talking about all this stuff. Anyway, I found Mark. He had been in Heart for 10 years after Firefall. When Heart and then he left the band like 5 or 6 years. They were inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And he was so annoyed that they were promoting Hart's induction into the Hall of Fame using pictures of the band when he was in the band. And he said, they can't do that. That's my name and likeness. So I went out and found a lawyer. And the lawyer that I found handled the case. And he said to me, the only reason I'm going to handle this for you is because I want the big one. And he knew what he meant. That's how that whole thing came about. Anyway, I have an interview with Mark Andes in here, and no one has ever spoken since that case has concluded, because Mark had joined the estate of Randy California on the plaintiff's side. So he talks all about what happened and the whole thing. And I don't know if people know, but Zeppelin won the case, but then it was appealed and was going to be about to be overturned. And the judge appealed it, and they had a second trial. And the plaintiffs said, look, all you have to do is play the beginning of Taurus and the beginning of Stairway to Heaven. No question that's where it came from. And the judge said, no, I'm not going to let you play that for the jury. And they said, what do you mean? They'll hear it in a minute. We'll win the case. And he goes, they copyrighted the song, Jimmy did, as in writing as a folio, not on sound like a demo. Of course, Zeppelin would never do demos. He said, we'll allow the jury to look at the two folios from the songs. Now, no jury is going to look at musical notes and know that it sounds alike. So, they didn't win the second time, but they had a good chance of doing it if they could have heard it. So anyway, so I got a lot of stories like that in here, a lot of really,
Wasn't there another famous lawsuit about from the first Led Zeppelin album that they had taken credit or taken
oh yeah,
away
no, I
from
got
some
on.
bluesmen?
Listen, I was working on a radio show called Cold Cases of Rock, all about people who stole songs from other people. And I happened to be up at Sirius seeing Tim Sabian, who who was in charge of the Howard Stern channels at the time. But, I've known him for a long time, and they were looking for other people to bring shows to them. So I was in Tim's office playing him this little 3-minute demo I have of, of the show. And Howard comes walking by, and Tim says, Howard, you got to hear this. And he played him the thing where I showed all the Zeppelin songs that were stolen, and Howard flipped out. He goes, we were just having a discussion about this on the air a couple months ago because people were saying, a whole lot of love was written by somebody else. But he goes, I want you to come on my show and go through the scenario of all this stuff. He says, I'm going to call you on the air next week and set up a time for you to come in and be on the show. I said, okay. So, next he calls me at 6 o'clock in the morning and I'm half asleep. And he says, okay, I'm going to put Gary on the phone and Gary's going to find a date. And, it was like 2 months later, I went on the show and I was like I got prepared. I listed all the songs and where they came from and all this kind of stuff. And I played all the Zeppelin songs and I played the songs where they were derived from. And I actually found every song on the first album coming from somewhere else except Good Times, Bad Times. I couldn't find anything. But Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, and I have Jake Holmes, who wrote Dazed and Confused. I'm sorry, yeah, Dazed and Confused, which obviously the centerpiece of Zeppelin's live show. Jake had written a song called Dazed and Confused and was on his debut album. And he opened for the Yardbirds in 1968. And I got two of the Yardbirds to say, yeah, we saw him do that. And Jimmy and I went down to Bleecker Bob's, which is a collector's record store in the village. I don't know if it's still there.
I remember Bleecker Bob's.
We bought a copy of the album, and Jimmy said, we're going to do a version of this. This is a great song for us. We could stretch it out. And well, and they never gave Jake any credit. So I interviewed Jake Holmes, and I said, Jake, all these years have gone by, and didn't you know that? He goes, no. He says, I got to tell you, I left the music business to go into the jingle writing, the advertising business. He goes, I wrote, I'm a pepper, he's a pepper, a lot of famous jingles, be all you can be for the army. And he goes, I had no idea. Somebody had mentioned it to me and everything, but then when you called me to be interviewed, and you showed me, when he left my interview, he went and got a lawyer, and he won. And you'll notice his credits are on there. The credits on the first album have changed considerably. Now, the other one that's interesting is Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You, which Jimmy admits he got it from a Joan Baez album, but he says it was a traditional song. That's the way Joan had credited it, traditional, arranged by Joan Baez. However, there is a woman in California, she was a folk singer, Anne Breeden, and she actually wrote the song in the 50s. And when Baez did it, she didn't know who wrote it, so she just put down traditional. And what happened was, this is kind of interesting, she was still playing guitar, years after. And one day she was playing, Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You. And her 15-year-old son came in and said, Mom, why are you playing a Zeppelin song? And she said, Zeppelin song? I wrote that song. And he had to tell her about it. She had no idea that they had recorded it. So you got those. Trying to think of the rest of the songs on the first album, but there were two that were credited to Willie Dixon that Howlin' Wolf had done, and but basically the majority of those songs were taken. And I think what happened, knowing what people tell me about Peter Grant, is Jimmy may have said, this is very similar to a song. You think we'll get in trouble? And Peter Grant probably said, fuck it. What are they going to do? Sue us? And that's really, no, that's how they got all those songs. Whole Lot of Love. Willie Dixon wrote that, and it was on the second album. His daughter heard it on the radio one day, years after it came out, and she initiated the suit. And Willie got a settlement, and he got a credit on there, if you look at that album. The only one that never came to fruition was, of course, Stairway to Heaven until years later. But yeah, they a lot of their songs were nicked. Actually, Whole Lot of Love was not only nicked from Willie Dixon, they took it from the Small Faces. Small Faces version on their first album is identical to the way Zeppelin does it with the woman. That's all in there by Steve Marriott. So that's where they stole it from. And the Small Faces were a favorite band of Robert Plant's. So he had seen them do it, and that's where he picked up, his version of it. So there's fascinating stories behind all these stories. And although people have talked about some of these things over the years, no one has actually ever, put this stuff down on paper and document it and everything. So that's really what I tried to do. And, the book is
It's
out
almost
now.
like a reference book.
Yeah, it's out. You can get it from Amazon. It'll be in Barnes and Noble. Although I heard the Barnes and Noble around here, they only had two copies. They sold it out already. The best place to get it is from Amazon, and you'll get it in the mail. And I have had so many people call me asking me to come by, or they wanted to come by, and I'll sign it. And so, and it's a deluxe, hardcover. The original wasn't a hardcover. And it's like a coffee table book, like you said. So, but I think, of course, I'm biased. I think it's the definitive work on the history of the band, only because I covered so much stuff, and everybody I talked to had credibility. Real quick, one of the people I spoke to was Nicky Hopkins. Nicky Hopkins was a famous session player. Actually, it was from an old interview I had. And he said, this is what people thought of this band when they started. This is not just Nicky telling me this. Terry Reid, who was going to be the original singer, said the same thing. He goes, Jimmy asked me to be the keyboard player in Led Zeppelin. I mean, asked me to be the keyboard player in the new Yardbirds. And I said, I don't want to be a keyboard player with the Yardbirds. Are you kidding me? Jeff Beck just asked me to join his group. So I'm going to go with Jeff Beck. Biggest mistake I ever made. Uh, Other people that they asked to join the band, they wanted the drummer to be, I think it was the drummer who had been in Procol Harum. I can't remember his name now. And of course, Terry Reid was the vocalist that they wanted, but Terry said, I just got a solo deal and I'm going on tour with the Rolling Stones as their opening act in America. So I can't do it. But he recommended Robert Plant. I'll tell you one other really neat story. Chris Drea, who just recently passed away, original member of the Yardbirds, told me that when Jimmy was putting together the new band, they wanted Chris to be the bass player. And he said, no, I'm into photography. That's my other passion. I want to become a photographer. And he took the picture that's on the back of the first album. But he said to me, I was still friends with Jimmy when we broke up. Jimmy went up to check out Robert Plant up in Birmingham, or outside Birmingham. And he said, I went with him. It was Peter Grant and Jimmy and myself. We went up to check out this singer. And we get up there, and there's Robert Plant in this band called Obstweedle or something like that. And Jimmy said, well, I don't know about the singer. I'm not sure. But that drummer, he's a must have. And that was Bonham. So even Jimmy wasn't, he said, all right, we'll try out Robert, but I don't know. I got to see if he works. And he invited Robert to his house and they, got to know each other and it worked out. But Bonham was really the surprise to everybody. And of course, the whole thing is based on the drums. So that was a major to do. And I never heard anybody actually say that, but Chris was an eyewitness. So.
Wasn't that Band of Joy, that group that Bonham
No,
and
no, this was a band. He was in so many different bands. This was a band called Obstweedle, which included Bonham and Plant. I don't think Bonham was in Band of Joy.
oh,
He was in some other bands. And when they originally, he left, when Obstweedle broke up, they were only around for a very short period of time. Bonham started playing drums for a guy named Tim Rose. Tim Rose is the guy who claims to have written Hey Joe and Morning Dew and a few other songs. He's a folk singer. He's got a few albums out. Very interesting guy. Bonham was the drummer. And when they sent a telegram, first of all, both Plant and Bonham, when they got a telegram from Peter Grant, they thought it was a joke. So they disregarded it. They had to, finally call him or get somebody to go up to their house. But Bonham initially said, well, no, I'm making $150 a week playing with Tim Rose. I don't want to give up my salary. So they said, oh, don't worry, we'll make up the 150 before the band even starts. But you got to be our drummer. And that's how that
for
came about.
for Led Zeppelin fans like myself who picked up your book, Get the Lead Out, when it first came out in 2012.
Yeah.
Uh, Tell me about this new, in the 13 years since, what's some of the new stuff? How many more pages? That
Okay,
kind of
I
stuff.
added 200 and some pages. I
Wow.
took the best of the original. Like I kept the Alice Cooper interview. I kept the Jake Holmes interview. There's a couple people that have passed away. I kept them. But basically, I think it was like 10 interviews from the original book. The rest of it's all new. It's 200 and some pages. I updated the discography. I added extra memorabilia. Like the stuff I showed you that Craig Kalman gave me, the covers. I never even knew they existed. So it's definitely a new book, even though they consider it an updated. And it's been what, 13 years since the original
Yeah.
one came out. So a lot's happened since then. I have all the discography has been updated, including the solo albums and other interviews that over the years I did with Robert Plant, which is, oh, I didn't finish answering your story about the Stairway to Heaven. I got to tell you the
Yes.
story.
Oh,
I,
Stairway to Gilligan's
Stairway
Island.
to Gilligan's Island, which for those that don't know is it's the music of um, Stairway to Heaven with the lyrics of Gilligan's Island, right? I got that right, or is it the other way around?
No, it's the theme to Gilligan's Island done to the melody of
Yeah,
Stairway to Heaven.
right. So I remember interviewing Robert in the early 2000s, and I waited till the last question because I thought, I don't know how he's going to react to this. I said, "So, Robert, what did you ever hear the version of Stairway to Gilligan's Island?" He said, "Yeah, it's brilliant." I said, "Well, why did you stop it?" He goes, "I didn't stop it. Our lawyer did. But if anybody would have asked me, I would have let it go. I thought it was one of the funniest things I ever heard." So I know it's out there on the collector's market and it's on some compilation. If you've never heard it, it is hysterical.
And it's probably on YouTube, I would
Yeah,
think.
it is on YouTube.
I actually have a copy of the 45.
Yeah, me too. Yeah.
And the B-side is a takeoff on Neil Young's Cinnamon Girl called Kennedy Girls. I
Oh,
want to be with a Kennedy girl.
yeah.
And what I didn't know until recently, I still have the 45. What I
Yeah.
didn't know until recently is that the guy behind that whole project was a longtime friend of mine, Kenny Laguna, who manages, produces, and co-writes with Joan Jett
And plays
for
keyboards, doesn't he? Plays keyboards.
and yeah,
Amazing.
he's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame as the keyboard player
Yeah.
in the Blackhearts.
Well,
Uh,
anyway, I tried to get as much as I could in here. I don't think there's going to be another revision. But if people go to my website, it's called rockandrollforgrownups.com, or just Google Get the Let Out book, Denny Summit, whatever. Go to my website. You can see, you can order the book there. You can see a bunch of other things on there. And, hopefully our podcast does pretty well. So anybody that listens to us on a regular basis will know how to get to me. And if you email me, my email address is on there. I'll answer it because I usually do answer the emails. Because, somebody, I've emailed people, and when you get an answer, you know what that's like. So,
yeah.
anyway.
Well, this has been fun.
Oh, thank you for doing this. I appreciate it. I was trying to think of, I can't host my own show. I got to get, who's the best interviewer I know? And of course, it's you. You've interviewed so many people, and you've kept them all. You have all of them.
Maybe one of these days we'll switch sides
Yeah.
and you'll interview me.
Yes, you bring some samples along. That would be great because I know you have some incredible things. So, anyway,
Oh,
once again, thanks. The name of the book is Get the Let Out. You can find it at Amazon or some of the stores. It's a real book. It's not, I didn't self-publish it. It's Hachette is the publisher. They're the third largest publisher in the world. So, it's out there, and I hope people enjoy it.
it
Thank you for
really is a
doing this.
great coffee table book. There's so much content, pictures, stories, memorabilia, a great collection edition. Denny, thank you so much. I guess I'll turn the reins of the show back over to you.
Okay. Anyway, that's today's rock podcast. I'm Denny Somack. I want to thank my friend Neal Mirsky for filling in because I didn't want to interview myself. And I thought he did a great job. And, go out and get the book. If you have comments, get me through my website. Let me know. And until the next rock podcast, Denny Somack. See you later.